The shuttle was falling apart around her when Dr. Elena Vasquez opened her eyes for the last time before impact. She could hear the metal screaming as it tore through the atmosphere of Kethros 4. And she knew in that moment that death was coming for her like it had come for every other human who had ever set foot on this cursed world. She grabbed the safety harness with both hands and pulled it tight against her chest as the emergency lights bathed everything in a bloody red glow. The pilot was already dead, his neck bent at an angle that no living creature could survive. And the co-pilot was unconscious and bleeding from a wound on his head that looked too deep for hope. The ground came up fast and hard and unforgiving. Elena felt the impact in every bone of her body as the shuttle carved a burning path through the alien jungle, snapping trees that were older than human civilization and leaving a trail of fire and destruction that stretched for nearly a kilometer. She felt her legs snap like a dry branch, and she screamed until darkness swallowed her whole. When she woke again, the world was silent except for the crackling of flames and the distant calls of creatures she could not name. The sky above was turning from orange to purple as the alien sun began to set, and Elena knew with terrible certainty that she needed to move before nightfall. She had read the reports about Kethros 4 during her training at the Galactic Union Xenobiology Institute. Every cadet had read them because they were required reading for anyone foolish enough to dream of studying alien life. The reports were simple and brutal, and left no room for hope. Kethros 4 was home to the Vorak. The Vorak were apex predators, standing 8 feet tall with armored hides that could stop pulse rifle fire and serrated limbs that could tear through ship hulls like paper. They had 4 eyes that glowed in the darkness and teeth designed for crushing bone and ripping flesh. They hunted in packs of 20 or more, and they had killed every single expedition that had ever landed on their world. 14 expeditions over 60 years. 347 soldiers, scientists, and explorers. Not one survivor until now. Elena thought bitterly as she dragged herself from the wreckage with her broken leg screaming in protest. Until now, when a xenobiologist with no weapons and no hope had somehow lived through a crash that should have killed her instantly, she found her emergency pack in the debris and pulled it close. Inside were medical supplies, water purification tablets, emergency rations for 2 weeks, a beacon that was sparking and clearly broken, and a small tablet containing all her research notes. No weapons, because she was a scientist, not a soldier. Elena set her own leg using techniques she had learned in survival training. She screamed into her own arm to muffle the sound, because she knew that the Vorak had excellent hearing, and she did not want to announce her location to every predator on the planet. She wrapped the leg in emergency splints and injected herself with painkillers that made the world go soft and fuzzy around the edges. Then she began to build a shelter from the wreckage. Night fell fast on Kethros 4, and with the darkness came the sounds that Elena had hoped never to hear outside of training videos. The low rumbling clicks of Vorak hunting calls echoed through the jungle, bouncing off trees and rocks until they seemed to come from everywhere. At once she pressed herself against the cold metal of her shelter and tried not to breathe. The first Vorak emerged from the darkness like a nightmare given flesh. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall at the shoulder, with a hide that was dark gray and covered in old scars that spoke of countless battles survived. Its 4 eyes glowed a soft amber in the darkness, and they were fixed directly on Elena with an intelligence that the scientific reports had never mentioned. This was the alpha of the pack. Elena could tell by its size and the way it moved with absolute confidence, like a creature that had never known fear in its entire life. It had killed humans before. She was certain of it. Behind the alpha, she could see more shapes moving in the shadows. The rest of the pack, circling, waiting for their leader to make the first move. Elena knew she should be terrified. She knew she should be screaming or crying or praying to whatever gods might listen to a dying woman on an alien world. But instead, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The kind of calm that comes when you realize that fear is pointless because death is already certain, and in that calm, she noticed something that changed everything. The Alpha was wounded. There was a deep gash along its left flank, a wound that looked several days old and was clearly infected. The flesh around it was swollen and discolored, and Elena could see that the creature was favoring its right side, putting less weight on the injured limb than it should. She was a xenobiologist. She had spent her entire adult life studying alien creatures and learning to see them not as monsters, but as living beings with their own needs and desires and pain. And right now, looking at this terrifying predator that could kill her with a single swipe of its massive claws, all she could see was a wounded animal that was suffering. Elena reached slowly into her pack, her movements deliberate and non-threatening, and pulled out a protein bar. The Alpha watched her with those 4 glowing eyes, its head tilting slightly to one side in a gesture that looked almost curious. It did not attack, did not even move, just watched as this strange small creature reached out with something in its trembling hand. Elena placed the protein bar on the ground between them and slowly backed away until she was pressed against the wall of her shelter once more. She did not know why she did it. It made no logical sense, no survival sense, no sense of any kind that the Galactic Union would recognize. But something in her gut told her that this was the right thing to do, maybe the only thing to do. The Alpha approached the offering slowly, sniffing at it with nostrils that flared wide. It looked back at Elena, then at the protein bar, then at Elena again, and then it ate. The protein bar disappeared in a single bite, and the Alpha made a sound that Elena had never heard in any recording, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground and into her bones. It was not a threatening sound, she realized with amazement. It was something else entirely. The pack in the shadows grew still. The Alpha turned and walked back into the darkness, and one by one, the other Vorik followed until Elena was alone once more. She did not understand what had just happened, did not understand why she was still alive when every piece of data said she should be dead, but she was alive and somewhere in the darkness. A wounded monster was deciding what to do about the strange creature that had offered it food instead of fear. The sun rose over Kethros 4 and painted the alien sky in colors that Elena had no names for. Shades of purple and gold and a deep crimson that made the clouds look like they were bleeding. She had survived her first night on a world that had killed hundreds before her, and she still did not understand how or why she ate a small breakfast from her rations and checked her supplies. She had enough food for maybe 12 more days if she was careful, enough water tablets for a month, and enough medical supplies to keep her leg from getting infected. The beacon was still broken, sparking uselessly whenever she tried to activate it. No one was coming to save her. Elena accepted this truth with a calmness that surprised her. Perhaps it was the painkillers still flowing through her system. Or perhaps it was something deeper, an understanding that panic would not help her survive. She needed to think, to plan, to use every bit of knowledge she had gathered in her years of studying alien life. The Alpha returned at midday. Elena heard it before she saw it. That low rumbling click that she was beginning to recognize as a kind of announcement. A way of saying I am here and I am not hiding. The massive creature emerged from the tree line and stood at the edge of her camp, watching her with those 4 amber eyes. She reached for another protein bar. This time, she did not just place it on the ground. This time, she held it out in her open palm and waited, her heart beating so hard she was certain the Vorik could hear it. The Alpha approached slowly, its movements careful and deliberate, until its enormous head was close enough that Elena could feel the heat of its breath on her skin. It took the food from her hand. The touch was gentle, impossibly gentle for a creature with teeth the size of her fingers. The Alpha made that same low rumbling sound from the night before, and Elena found herself smiling despite her fear. "You are welcome," she said softly, knowing the words meant nothing, but hoping the tone would carry her intent. "I am Elena, and I am not going to hurt you." The Alpha tilted its head at the sound of her voice, and Elena could swear she saw something like curiosity in those alien eyes. It did not leave after eating this time, but instead settled onto the ground a few meters away, its massive body folding with a grace that belied its size. It was showing her its wounded side. Elena understood immediately. She had worked with injured animals before, creatures from a dozen different worlds, and she knew an invitation when she saw one. The Alpha was asking for help in the only way it knew how, by making itself vulnerable to a creature it barely knew. She gathered her medical supplies and approached slowly, speaking in that same soft tone. "I am going to help you. I am going to make it better. Please do not eat me." The Alpha remained still as Elena knelt beside it and examined the wound. It was worse than she had thought, deep and infected and filled with debris from whatever had caused the injury. She would need to clean it and treat it and hope that her human medicines would work on an alien physiology that no scientist had ever studied. Up close, she worked for over an hour while the Alpha watched her with unblinking eyes. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic that made the creature hiss in discomfort. She removed the debris with tweezers and steady hands. She applied antibiotic cream and covered everything with clean bandages that looked absurdly small against the massive flank. When she was done, the Alpha stood and shook itself like a wet dog, testing the bandages with movements that were almost playful. It made a new sound then, a series of rapid clicks that rose and fell like laughter. And Elena found herself laughing too. The other Vorik appeared throughout the afternoon. They came in ones and twos, emerging from the jungle to observe this strange scene. Their Alpha, the strongest and most feared among them, sitting calmly beside a tiny alien creature that smelled of chemicals and strange foods. They did not approach, but they did not attack either. Just watched with those glowing eyes. Elena counted 15 of them before the sun began to set. Males and females, adults and juveniles, all part of the same pack that had been classified as mindless killing machines by every scientist who had studied them from orbit. But Elena was not in orbit anymore. She was on the ground, living among them, and she could see what the satellites and drones had never captured. She could see the way the adults groomed the juveniles, the way the males deferred to the females around the young ones, the way they communicated with clicks and gestures that formed a language, far more complex than anyone had imagined. The Vorik were not monsters. They were a society. Over the following days, Elena established a routine. She would wake at dawn and share her breakfast with the Alpha, whom she began calling Scar because of the old wounds that covered its hide. Scar would allow her to check his bandages and change them when needed. And in return, he would stay near her shelter during the day, his presence keeping the rest of the pack at a cautious distance. Her rations began to run low after the first week, and Elena knew she would need to find food soon or starve. She tried to eat some of the alien plants around her camp, but most of them made her sick, and the ones that did not tasted so terrible that she could barely force them down. Scar solved her problem in a way she had not expected on the 8th day. The Alpha returned from a hunt, carrying something in its massive jaws. It dropped the carcass at Elena's feet and stepped back, making that rumbling sound she had come to associate with approval. It was an offering, she realized, a gift of food from a creature that owed her nothing. Elena stared at the dead animal for a long moment. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a 6-legged creature with fur that shimmered like metal. She had no idea if it was safe to eat. No idea if her human body could process alien proteins without poisoning her. But she was hungry, and Scar was watching. And she understood that this was a test as much as a gift. She built a fire using techniques from her survival training and cooked the meat until it was charred and smoking. She took a small bite, chewed carefully, and waited for the sickness that might come. It never did, and the meat tasted surprisingly good. Rich and fatty and full of nutrients, her starving body desperately needed. Scar made that laughing sound again. And Elena smiled. The other Vorak began to approach her camp after that. Not close, not yet, but closer than before. They brought her gifts of their own. Small animals and strange fruits, and once, bizarrely, a shiny rock that one of the juveniles dropped at her feet before running away in apparent embarrassment. Elena was being accepted. She did not know what it meant or where it would lead. But she knew that something extraordinary was happening on this world that had been written off as a death sentence. A human and a pack of monsters were learning to trust each other, one meal at a time and in the quiet moments of the night. When Scar slept beside her shelter and the pack sang their strange clicking songs to the stars, Elena began to hope that she might actually survive. 6 weeks had passed since the crash, and Elena Vasquez was no longer the same woman who had fallen from the sky. Her clothes had been replaced by hides from the animals the pack hunted. Her hair had grown wild and tangled, and her skin had darkened under the alien sun. But the biggest change was not in how she looked. The biggest change was in how she saw the world. Elena had spent her entire career studying aliens from a distance, reading reports and analyzing data, and forming theories based on observations made through telescopes and drones. She had thought she understood what it meant to be a xenobiologist, what it meant to study life forms that had evolved on worlds far from Earth. She had been wrong about everything living with the Varak had taught her. That understanding could not come from distance. It could only come from connection, from sharing meals and treating wounds and learning to communicate through gestures and sounds that had no human equivalent. The Vorak were not the mindless predators that the Galactic Union had described in their reports. They were people. Elena had documented everything she observed in her tablet, filling page after page with notes that would revolutionize xenobiology if she ever made it off this world. She had discovered that the Varak had a complex social hierarchy based not just on strength, but on wisdom and experience. The Alpha was not simply the biggest or the strongest, but the one who had proven themselves capable of leading the pack through danger and difficulty. She had learned that they mourned their dead. She had watched them gather around a fallen pack member, a young male who had been killed by a poisonous creature during a hunt. They had made sounds she had never heard before, low-keening wails that needed no translation. They had buried the body in a clearing and visited the spot for days afterward. She had discovered that they used tools. Primitive ones, yes, but tools nonetheless. She had seen them select specific rocks for cracking open the shells of certain prey animals, had watched them fashion simple digging implements from branches. No survey team had ever survived long enough to witness this, but Elena had. Because she had taken the time to earn their trust, the pack had grown accustomed to her presence, and she had learned to read their moods through their body language and the tones of their clicking calls. She knew when they were happy and when they were anxious, when they were preparing for a hunt and when they were settling in for rest. She had even been given a name in their language, a series of clicks that she could not quite reproduce, but that roughly translated to small one who gives food. She liked the name. Scar had become her constant companion, sleeping outside her shelter every night and accompanying her whenever she ventured into the jungle to gather. The plants she had learned were safe to eat. The other Vorak had accepted her too, each in their own way. The females would allow her to approach their young, a sign of trust so profound that Elena had cried the first time it happened. One of the juveniles had become particularly attached to her, a young female about the size of a large dog, still too small to join the hunts, but old enough to be curious about everything. Elena had named her Spark because of the way her eyes seemed to glow brighter than the others when she was excited. Spark would follow Elena around the camp, mimicking her gestures and making sounds that seemed like attempts to speak her language. Elena taught Spark simple things: how to wave hello, how to nod yes, and shake her head no, how to point at objects. The young Vorak learned quickly, faster than Elena had thought possible. And soon they had developed their own simple language of gestures and sounds that allowed them to communicate basic ideas. The rest of the pack watched these lessons with interest. And soon other juveniles were joining in, and then some of the adults. Within weeks, Elena had established a rudimentary communication system with the entire pack. A bridge between two species that had never been meant to understand each other. And then the rival pack arrived. Elena heard them before she saw them. Different clicking patterns, aggressive and territorial, echoing through the jungle from the east. Scar's head snapped up immediately, and he made a sound she had never heard before. A deep warning growl that seemed to shake the very air. The pack mobilized in seconds. The females gathered the juveniles and moved them toward a defensive position near a rocky outcropping. The males formed a line beside Scar, their bodies tense and ready for violence. Elena found herself being pushed toward the females by one of the adult males, guided firmly but gently to safety. She did not want to be safe. She wanted to understand what was happening. The rival pack emerged from the trees, and Elena counted at least 20 of them. Larger on average than her own pack and led by an alpha that made Scar look almost small by comparison. They spread out in a semicircle, their clicks and growls forming a challenge that needed no translation. This was a territory dispute, Elena realized. The rival pack wanted these hunting grounds, and they were willing to fight for them. Scar stepped forward to meet the challenge, and Elena's heart clenched with fear. He was strong and brave, but the rival alpha was bigger, and her pack was outnumbered. This could end very badly for the creatures she had come to love. The two alphas circled each other, exchanging clicks and growls in what seemed like a ritualized confrontation. Elena watched from her position among the females, her hands clenched into fists, wishing desperately that there was something she could do. And then the rival alpha lunged. The fight was brutal and fast and terrifying. The two massive creatures slammed into each other with enough force to shake the ground. Claws tore at armored hides. Teeth snapped at vulnerable throats. Blood began to flow from wounds on both sides. Scar was losing. Elena could see it in the way he moved, the way he favored his side where the old wound had been. He was slower than the rival alpha, less able to dodge the savage attacks. A particularly vicious blow sent him crashing to the ground, and the rival alpha loomed over him, ready to deliver the killing strike. Elena did not think. She simply acted. She burst from the group of females and ran toward the fight, screaming at the top of her lungs, waving her arms like a madwoman. The rival alpha froze, completely confused by this tiny creature that was charging directly at it with no weapons and no fear. It gave Scar the moment he needed. The wounded alpha surged up from the ground and drove his claws into the rival's exposed throat. The rival staggered backward, blood pouring from the fatal wound. It collapsed moments later, its eyes going dark. The rival pack fled into the jungle, their leader dead, and their challenge failed. Elena's pack raised their voices in clicks of triumph, but Elena barely heard them. She was kneeling beside Scar, checking his wounds. Crying and laughing at the same time, Scar made that rumbling sound of approval. And Elena threw her arms around his massive neck. She was packed now, truly and completely. She had proven it in the way that mattered most to the Vorak. She had stood beside them when danger came, had risked her life for her family, and the pack would never forget it. 3 months after the crash, Elena woke to a sound she had not heard since falling from the sky. The distant roar of engines, the unmistakable whine of a spacecraft entering the atmosphere of Cathros 4. She scrambled out of her shelter and stared up at the purple morning sky. Her heart pounding with emotions she could not name as ship was coming, Scar appeared beside her, his 4 eyes tracking the bright point of light descending through the clouds. He made a low clicking sound, a question in his strange language, and Elena placed her hand on his scarred flank to reassure him. "I do not know," she said softly. "I do not know if this is good or bad." The ship landed in a clearing about 2 kilometers from her camp. It was a military vessel. She could tell from the shape and the weapons mounted on its hull. The Galactic Union had sent soldiers, not scientists. And Elena understood immediately what that meant. They had come to recover her body, not to rescue her. She gathered her tablet and her notes and made her way toward the landing site. Scar followed close behind, and the rest of the pack spread out through the jungle on either side. They were curious about these newcomers, but they were also wary, and Elena could hear their warning clicks echoing through the trees. The soldiers were waiting for her at the edge of the clearing. 12 of them, armed with pulse rifles and wearing combat armor that had been designed specifically to resist Morok attacks. Their leader was a tall Torvali, one of the blue-skinned species that dominated the Galactic Union military. His name tag read Captain Urin. He stared at Elena like she was a ghost. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, his voice flat with disbelief. "You are alive," Elena smiled, despite the tension in the air. "I am, Captain." "And I am not alone." Scar chose that moment to emerge from the trees, his massive form casting a shadow over the entire clearing. The soldiers raised their weapons immediately, their fingers tight on the triggers, their eyes wide with fear. "Stand down," Captain Urin commanded, though his own hand had moved to his sidearm. "Dr. Vasquez, step away from the creature. We will handle this. Handle this." Elena moved to stand directly between Scar and the soldiers. "Captain, this creature is not a threat. He is my friend. He and his pack have kept me alive for 3 months on a world that has killed everyone else who ever landed here." Captain Urin's blue face showed no emotion. "The Varrock are classified as non-sapient hostile fauna. Our orders are to extract any survivors and neutralize any threats to the extraction team. Step aside, Doctor." "No." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Elena could feel Scar's warmth at her back, could hear the clicks of the pack members hidden in the jungle around them. She knew that if the soldiers opened fire, many would die on both sides, and everything she had worked to build would be destroyed in seconds. "Captain," she said, keeping her voice calm and steady, "I am a xenobiologist with the Galactic Union Science Division. I have spent 3 months living among the Varrock, studying them, learning to communicate with them. I have data that will completely change everything we thought we knew about this species." Captain Urin's eyes narrowed. "Data does not change the fact that these creatures have killed over 300 Union personnel. It does not bring back the soldiers and scientists who died screaming on this world." "You are right," Elena said. "It does not. But it might explain why they died, and it might prevent more deaths in the future. Captain, the Varrock are not mindless killers. They are a pre-sapient species with complex social structures, emotional bonds, and the capacity for trust and loyalty. Every expedition that came here before treated them as monsters to be avoided or destroyed. I treated them as people to be understood. And that made the difference?" The captain's voice was skeptical. Elena nodded. "It made all the difference in the universe." She turned and made a series of clicking sounds, gestures she had practiced 1,000 times over the past months. Scar responded by lowering himself to the ground, making himself smaller and less threatening. The soldiers watched in stunned silence as the massive predator essentially bowed before the tiny human woman. "You cannot make peace with animals," Captain Urin said. But there was uncertainty in his voice. Now Elena smiled sadly. "That is exactly what your ancestors said about the Torvali 3,000 years ago, Captain. The historical records are very clear. Your species was classified as non-sapient hostile fauna until a human. Scientists spent 5 years living among them and proved otherwise. The captain flinched as if she had struck him. The Tavali were sensitive about their history, about the centuries they had spent being hunted and enslaved, before humanity had advocated for their recognition as sentient beings. It was a debt they had never forgotten. That was different, he said, but his voice had lost its conviction. Was it? Elena gestured at Scar, at the jungle where the rest of the pack waited. I have seen these creatures mourn their dead, Captain. I have watched them care for their young with tenderness that would put many sapient species to shame. I have taught them to communicate with gestures and sounds. And they have taught me things about survival and loyalty that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. One of the soldiers, a young human woman with nervous eyes, lowered her rifle slightly. Captain, maybe we should hear her out. The Science Division will want to see her data. Captain Urin was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes moving from Elena to Scar to the jungle beyond. He was calculating. Elena knew, weighing the risks against the potential rewards, trying to decide if she was telling the truth or if she had simply lost her mind after months of isolation. Dr. Vasquez, he said finally, I have orders to neutralize any threats to my team. If these creatures attack, we will defend ourselves. They will not attack, Elena said. Not unless you attack first. I give you my word, Captain. The captain's jaw tightened. The word of a human who has been living with monsters. Forgive me if I find that less than reassuring. Then let me prove it, Elena said. Give me 1 hour to show you what I have discovered. If you are not convinced, I will come with you willingly, and you can do whatever you want with the Vark. But if I am right, if they are what I say they are, then you will have made first contact with a new intelligent species. Your name will be in the history books, Captain. Captain Urin stared at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he raised his hand and signaled his soldiers to lower their weapons. 1 hour, he said. And if any of my people are harmed, I will personally make sure these creatures are wiped from the face of this planet. Elena smiled and turned to face Scar, placing her hand on his scarred face. 1 hour, she repeated softly. That is all we need. The fate of an entire species now rested on what happened next. Elena spent the next hour showing Captain Urin everything she had learned. She demonstrated her communication system with Scar, showing how he responded to her gestures and sounds with understanding that no non-sapient creature could possess. She displayed her data on the tablet, the thousands of observations she had made about Varak society. Their tool use, their mourning rituals, their complex emotional lives, the soldiers watched in silence. Their weapons still ready, but their fear slowly giving way to something that looked almost like wonder. The young human woman who had first lowered her rifle moved closer to observe, her eyes bright with fascination. Even Captain Urin's stony expression began to crack as Elena called forward the juvenile she had named Spark. Spark bounded into the clearing with the enthusiasm of a puppy, her glowing eyes fixed on Elena with obvious affection. She performed the greeting gesture Elena had taught her, a wave of her clawed hand that looked almost human. When Elena offered her a piece of dried meat from her pouch, Spark took it gently and made the rumbling sound of approval that she had learned from watching the adults. She is learning, Elena explained. They all are. Given time and patience, I believe the Varak could develop full sapience within a few generations. We are not just witnessing an intelligent species, Captain. We are witnessing one in the process of becoming. Captain Urin said nothing, but Elena could see the conflict in his eyes. Everything he had been taught, everything he believed about this world and its inhabitants, was crumbling before him. It was not easy to admit that you had been wrong. especially when that wrongness might have contributed to the deaths of hundreds of people. The ground began to shake, at first. Elena thought it was her imagination, a tremor of exhaustion from the stress of the past hour. But then the shaking grew stronger, and she heard a sound like thunder coming from the mountains to the north. The Varak in the jungle began clicking in alarm, their calls rising in pitch and urgency. "Earthquake," one of the soldiers shouted. "Captain, we need to get back to the ship." They ran. The jungle floor heaved and buckled beneath their feet as they raced toward the clearing where the military vessel waited. Trees crashed down around them, and great cracks opened in the earth, swallowing everything in their path. Elena stumbled, her old leg injury flaring with pain. But Scar was there immediately, pressing against her side to keep her upright. They reached the clearing just as the worst of the quake struck. A massive landslide came roaring down from the hills above. A wall of rock and earth and broken trees that swept across the clearing like the fist of an angry god. The military ship was directly in its path, and several soldiers had already reached the boarding ramp. There was no time to run. The landslide struck with a force that shook the entire world. Elena was thrown to the ground, her ears ringing, her vision blurred by dust and debris. When she finally managed to look up, she saw a scene of utter devastation. The ship was half buried, its hull cracked and sparking. 3 soldiers were trapped beneath the rubble, their armor saving them from death, but leaving them pinned and helpless. Captain Urin was on his feet, shouting orders. But his remaining soldiers were too few and too weak to move the massive stones that imprisoned their comrades. And then the Varak came. Scar led the charge, his massive body plowing through the debris like it was nothing. Behind him came the other adults of the pack, their powerful limbs and clawed hands perfectly suited for moving rock and earth. They descended on the trapped soldiers, not with hunger or hostility, but with purpose. They began to dig. Elena watched in amazement as the creature she had come to love worked alongside the soldiers to free their trapped comrades. Scar himself pulled the largest stone away from a wounded soldier, his 4 eyes meeting the man's terrified gaze with something that looked like reassurance. The other Varak followed his lead, clearing debris with a coordination that spoke of intelligence and intent. Within minutes, all 3 trapped soldiers had been freed. Captain Urin stood in the middle of the ruined clearing, surrounded by the creatures he had been sent to destroy. And Elena could see that something fundamental had changed in him. He had watched monsters become saviors, had seen proof of what she had been trying to tell him written in the blood and sweat of a rescue he could never have accomplished alone. "They saved my people," he said quietly. "They did not have to do that." Elena smiled through her tears. "No, they did not. But that is what Pack does, Captain. That is what family does. They chose to help because I taught them that some beings are worth helping. That compassion is not weakness but strength." The captain was silent for a long moment, and then he did something Elena had not expected. He approached Scar slowly, carefully, and extended his hand in the universal gesture of greeting. Scar looked at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. And then the great Alpha reached out with his own massive hand and touched the captain's palm. It was not quite a handshake, but it was close enough. 1 month later, Elena stood before the Galactic Union Council on the station orbiting Kethras 4. She had presented her research, her data, her recommendations. She had argued passionately for the reclassification of the Varak and the establishment of a new research initiative focused on peaceful contact. Rather than extermination, the council had voted unanimously in her favor. Kethras 4's quarantine status was revised. No longer a death world to be avoided, it was now a protected sanctuary, home to a species on the verge of sapience, but the galaxy had a responsibility to nurture rather than destroy. Elena was appointed as the first official Varak ambassador, a position that had never existed before and that she had essentially created through sheer Stubborn refusal to give up Captain Yiren was there when she returned to the surface. He had requested a permanent posting on the planet, a chance to make amends for all the soldiers who had died before anyone thought to try understanding instead of fighting. Elena welcomed him warmly, and together they walked into the jungle where Scar and the pack were waiting in the Galactic archives. A new entry was added to the official records of humanity. It described how a single xenobiologist, armed with nothing but protein bars and an open heart, had done what armies could not. It explained how she had transformed the planet of monsters into a world of potential allies. How she had proven once again that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their numbers, but their impossible, irrational, world-changing capacity for compassion. The final line of the entry read simply, "When all others saw monsters, the humans saw a wound that needed healing. This is why they are dangerous. This is why they are necessary. This is why, when the darkness comes, the galaxy turns to them and asks for help." Elena read those words on her tablet as she sat beside Scar in the fading light of the alien sun. The pack was gathered around her, the young ones playing, the adults resting after a successful hunt. Spark was curled up at her feet, making soft clicking sounds in her sleep. This was home now, and it had all started with a protein bar and a prayer.